In closing today, I want to discuss a very important aspect of the history of socialism, not only in this country but throughout the world, and that is the question of the right of oppressed nations to self-determination. African Americans are an oppressed nation. We were brought here during the period of slavery, beginning in the 17th century. Even prior to being brought to the United States, many of our people were brought to the Caribbean and to Latin America as part of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, since the development of the socialist movements in Europe and the United States, the question of the right of self-determination and independence of oppressed people has been a major point of rigorous discussion, debate, and political struggle. And I just wanted to mention also that our newspaper, Workers' World, has been doing a series on African American History Month all during February. And the latest issue, which is available over here on the table, has a history of Malcolm X. Tomorrow, February 21st, represents the 45th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. 45 years ago, the FBI engineered the assassination of Malcolm X. And we have to remember Brother Malcolm X because his legacy is still relevant today. In fact, he's missed not only by the African American people, but by Muslims throughout the world.
That's right.
Because his leadership, not only as an African American, but as a Muslim, did a hell of a lot to fight against racism and national oppression in this country and throughout the world.
That's right.
And could you imagine what the political atmosphere would be right now involving Muslims and involving African Americans if Malcolm X was on the scene or someone of that caliber was on the scene that could actually speak up and speak against the assassination of Imam Lukman Amin Abdullah and speak against the persecution against Muslims in this country. And that's why he was assassinated, because he was a militant revolutionary as well as a Muslim. Now, even with the emergence of over 100 former colonial states during the 20th century, the issue of how progressives, how revolutionaries, and socialists should approach these developments in these states, these newly independent states, and the relationship of these countries and regions to the dominant imperialist powers largely determines the tactical approaches to such fundamental questions as war and peace, racism, national oppression, women's rights, and the character of the class structure within these oppressed nations. So if you don't have the national question right, it affects your tactics and it affects your style of work. And we've seen this throughout history, and we're going to discuss that this evening. Every serious Marxist theoretician and socialist organization has been forced to address the question of how to analyze the role of oppressed peoples in the overall struggle against capitalism and imperialism. The degree to which progressive and revolutionary organizations and movements develop correct positions on the national questions related to their particular political situations that are largely determine the success and the viability of the actions taken and the victories that they achieve. Slavery, colonialism, and capitalism brought destruction and death to billions of people throughout the world, and it still is. Beginning in the 15th century, the Western European nations of Spain and Portugal embarked upon the Atlantic slave trade, which captured and exploited Africans, exterminated the indigenous peoples in the colonies of the so-called New World, and established colonies all over the planet. As a result of these developments, the nations of Western Europe and eventually the United States became the dominant economic and political power in the world. Every major industry that came out of Europe and North America had its origins within the Atlantic slave trade.
Make it plain.
The profits accrued from the exploitation of African labor and the displacement of the indigenous people from their lands created the capital that developed and fueled the engines of industry, commerce, shipping, as well as banking. And if you don't believe me, you can read Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery. He documents it very clearly. All of these industries developed as a result of the profits accrued from the Atlantic slave trade. The vast accumulation of wealth was rationalized by the ruling classes of these Western European states and in North America when they claimed that the indigenous peoples of the North, South, Central America, of Africa, and the Caribbean needed to be, quote, civilized, unquote, and converted to a distorted form of Christianity that upheld the false notions of the superiority of the whites over the peoples of color. Other apologists for slavery and colonialism said that the mineral wealth and the agricultural potential of the world would have never been developed if the European ruling classes had not established these exploitative systems. This is what they argued, and they're still arguing this today.
That's right.
These ruling class thinkers and philosophers went as far as to interpret religious doctrine to suit their own interests. Africans and indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere were taught that they were cursed, and the oppressed were doomed to be servants of the ruling class.
Go ahead.
In addition, these peoples were told that if they accepted this worldview, there would be a reward in the afterlife, where paradise would be available to them if they remained obedient, and if they accepted their social status as the natural order of society. Now we know, even though it's been hidden, that African people have always resisted slavery and oppression. Despite the efforts of the European ruling elites to impose a permanent system of exploitation on African people and other oppressed peoples, these nations, societies, and cultures constantly resisted and revolted against slavery, against colonialism, and against genocide. In the Caribbean, it has been reported that the indigenous people fought the imposition of slavery and colonial occupation. Many even jumped to their deaths in the waterways in order to avoid the continued humiliation and oppression by the slave masters and the colonialists. In Africa, despite the fact that the Western Europeans came to the continent to enslave and colonize the people, there are numerous examples of battles waged aimed at halting the encroachment of the slave traders. These instances of resistance that have been documented point to the fact that the African people were able to maintain their humanity and their inherent desire for freedom and independence even under the threat of attack and domination. Just to give some examples, in 1564, in the area known now as Sierra Leone, a group of British traders led by a man named John Hawkins were attacked by an army of Africans who wounded several of these men and drove them from the inlands back to their ships on the coast.
All right.
By the time that these slave traders had reached the shores, some 200 Africans were awaiting them. The ensuing battle resulted in the deaths of 7 of Hawkins' most prized subordinates, including the captain of the ship known as the Salmon. The king in this area then began to mobilize a larger contingent of his military forces, which propelled Hawkins and his survivors to retreat to their ships and sail back to the Caribbean.
All right.
In another slave trading voyage, Hawkins was attempting to capture Africans along the Senegal River when his group was attacked by the local people with bows and poisonous arrows. The Europeans then moved further east to avoid attack, eventually heading for the Spanish Main. After this disastrous episode, James Pope Hennessy pointed out that it was well into the next century before the British embarked upon another slave expedition again, preferring less hazardous means of acquiring slave labor. The British began during the 17th century to attempt negotiation and trade as the principal method of obtaining Africans for exploitation in the newly established colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Such episodes during the 16th century were repeated during the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade in Africa. According to an article published in the South Carolina Gazette on July 7th of 1759, quote, a sloop commanded by a brother of Captain Igleju, slaving up the river Gambia, was attacked by a number of the natives about the 27th of February last and made a good defense. But the captain, finding himself desperately wounded and likely to be overcome, rather than fall into the hands of merciless wretches, when about 80 Negroes had boarded vessels, discharged a pistol into his magazine and blew her up. Himself and every soul on board perished. By providing these historical instances of resistance to slavery on the continent of Africa, it provides a basis for further research in order to more fully document the origin of Pan-African revolt and consciousness. Since these actions by Africans in opposition to the Atlantic slave trades occurred in various regions of the continent, it illustrates that there was a pattern of response to the advent of European imperialism. Even during the height of the slave period in the Western Hemisphere, the relationships between Africans and their homeland would continue to occupy a prominent role in the political discourse on the question of legalized bondage and the status of freed ex-slaves. When the Africans were transported, enslaved in the United States, the rebellions against the exploitative system continued.